The blizzard came in waves, thick flakes swirling like ghosts through the night. Nora had been out walking by the creek, hoping for some quiet time away from the chaos of her apartment. But now she regretted it. The snow was falling so heavily she could barely see 10 feet in front of her, the wind biting at her skin. The creek, usually a calm companion, was roaring now, its flow distorted by the heavy ice forming at the edges. As she hurried along the trail, Nora heard something else, something that didn't belong, a low, deep sound like a growl barely audible over the storm. Her heart skipped a beat. She paused, listening. The noise came again, this time louder, closer. The sound was odd, too wet, almost like a bubbling growl, as though something was caught beneath the water, struggling. Nora glanced nervously at the creek. The ice had crept over the edges, but the water still ran fast beneath, carrying the wild, cold current. She took a few more steps when she heard a cracking sound, something large, something heavy. Her breath quickened. She wasn't alone. A shadow emerged from the trees ahead, blotting out the faint light from her flashlight. At first, she thought it was a trick of the storm, but then the figure moved. It was tall, taller than any human, its hunched shoulders silhouetted against the snowy backdrop. It had an unnatural way of moving, dragging itself along the ground with long, unsettling strides, its head low and its arms bent at odd angles. Nora's blood ran cold. The creature's body was covered in thick, wiry fur, matted with ice and snow. But it was its face, or rather its lack of one, that made her stomach churn. Where a face should have been, there was only a blank, smooth expanse of skin, pale and stretched over something grotesque beneath. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were two hollow pits, dark and endless. It stopped, its head jerking up in her direction. It sniffed the air, and the sound was sharp and wet, like the breath of something long starved. Nora's mind screamed at her to run, but her feet were frozen in place. The creature took a slow step toward her, its claws clicking against the frozen ground. Suddenly, a gust of wind howled, forcing a wall of snow across her vision. The creature moved faster than she expected, a blur of motion, its claws scraping against the ice with a terrifying screech. Nora snapped out of her trance and bolted, her legs burning as she ran back the way she had come. Behind her, the creature moved, skittering through the snow, its growl rising in the wind. It was fast, too fast. Nora's feet slipped and she fell, her hands scraping across the ice. She scrambled to get up, but the creature was almost on her. She could hear it now, its breathing ragged, wet, like it was drowning on dry land. Panic surged through her chest, and she pushed herself to her feet, adrenaline rushing through her veins. The creek loomed ahead, the water dark and cold, a sudden flash of desperation in her mind. Without thinking, Nora dashed toward the edge and leapt, landing awkwardly on the snowbank on the other side. She stumbled but kept going, the creature's growls still echoing behind her. She didn't look back. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, slamming the door shut, her hands shaking as she started the engine. She drove fast, not caring about the icy roads, her eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror. The storm raged on, but she saw nothing in the snow. Yet, when she returned to the creek the next day, there were deep, elongated tracks in the snow along the banks, tracks that led back to the dark water, where the ice was cracked open in strange patterns. Something had been waiting for her. The dark, hollow pits where the creature's eyes should have been still haunted her dreams, and she kept imagining its long claws reaching for her, its chilling growl reverberating in her bones. She tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that it was just the stress of the storm and the isolation of the creek, but deep down, she knew she hadn't imagined it. Days passed, but the gnawing fear remained, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. She couldn't stop thinking about the tracks she had seen near the water's edge. Wide, clawed footprints that looked almost human, but stretched and twisted in ways no human foot ever could. It was as if the creature had been studying her, waiting. Then, one evening, Nora received a call. It was her friend Rachel, who had grown up in the small town near the creek. "You haven't heard, have you?" Rachel's voice was tight with something. Fear, maybe. "There's talk of strange things happening out there by the creek. Some hunters went missing last week. Others say they've seen things. People disappearing right near the water." Nora's heart stopped. She hadn't mentioned the creature to Rachel, had tried to block it from her mind entirely, but the dread crept back. "What kind of things?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Strange shapes. Some of them say they saw something like a giant, moving shadow. Others heard noises, like a creature calling from the depths of the creek. And there's more. You're not the only one who's noticed things, Nora. People say the creek itself is changing." "Changing?" Rachel hesitated. "The water's different. It's darker, colder, like it's pulling something down, something that doesn't belong." Nora felt a chill creep down her spine. She'd heard that same strange growl near the water, and it hadn't sounded like anything natural. She remembered the deep, wet breath of the creature, its hollow stare, and then it hit her. She had never seen the creature leave. It had just disappeared when she crossed the creek. But what if it hadn't? "I think I need to go back," Nora said, more to herself than Rachel. "What? No, Nora, don't go out there. Whatever's happening, it's not safe." But Nora wasn't listening. Her mind was made up. She had to know what had followed her from the creek, what was lurking just beyond the water's edge. She needed closure, needed to understand what it was that had been waiting for her in the dark. That night, Nora packed a bag and drove back to the creek. The storm had passed, but the cold lingered, hanging in the air like a curse. The landscape was eerily silent, save for the sound of the wind cutting through the trees. She parked at the same spot where she had run from the creature days before, the place where the snow had been disturbed. The road was empty, desolate, just as it had been the night she fled. Nora grabbed a flashlight from her bag and stepped out of the car, her breath visible in the air. Her heart thudded in her chest as she made her way to the creek, the ground beneath her feet, a patchwork of frozen earth and snow. The water seemed more alive than it had before. The current was faster, more violent, and the ice along the edges groaned under the pressure of the flowing water. It looked like it had been disturbed, torn open, as if something had emerged from below. The strange tracks were still there, deeper now, leading into the trees. Nora hesitated but followed the trail, her steps slow and careful. She reached the spot where the creature had crouched before, and as she scanned the area, she saw something move, a figure in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat. The creature was there. It was crouched on all fours, but its form had changed. It had grown, its body now towering over the creek like a monstrous shadow. The skin on its face was stretched, peeling back in places, revealing jagged teeth that shimmered in the moonlight. Its hollow eyes locked onto her, and Nora froze, her pulse racing in her ears. It opened its mouth, wide, impossibly wide, and let out a sound that vibrated through the ground, a guttural wail that seemed to carry the weight of centuries of darkness. Nora wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was caught in its gaze, trapped as though it had woven some kind of spell around her. The creature took a step forward and then another until it was standing right in front of her, towering above her. "I've been waiting," it whispered, its voice like the sound of the creek itself, low and cold. "Waiting for you to understand." Nora's mind reeled. Waiting for her to understand what? Suddenly she remembered Rachel's words. The creek was changing, and so was it. The creature wasn't just some beast. It was part of the creek, part of the water itself. It had always been there, lurking in the depths, waiting for the right moment to rise. The creature smiled, its grin spreading impossibly wide. "It's time for you to join me," it said. Nora's breath caught in her throat, but before she could scream, the ground beneath her feet cracked and the ice gave way. She plummeted into the icy water, the frigid current swallowing her whole. As she sank deeper, the world above her blurred, and she heard the creature's laughter echoing in the water. It wasn't over. It had just begun.